Well, this past several days within this rather cavernous basement chamber, as around the nation, a sense of liberation is palpable. Free at last, free at last, free from the oppression of wokeness, the reign of identity politics, the terror of cancellation, the velvet chains of DEI, free to speak in our classrooms, free to criticize COVID policy, free to challenge the experts, free to question sex and race-based quotas, free to push back against the idea that victimhood confers superior moral status. It was for good reason that the reign of woke was compared to life under the conditions of religious oppression, and for good reason why a number of speakers here these last few days have noted the ways that the progressive state sought to impose a new religious creed upon the nation. For several years, the sharpest minds in the conservative firmament have quickly come to recognize that this analogy of wokeness as a new religion was more than merely rhetorical, that wokeness was a new kind of religion, its instantiation in the law and culture, a new form of established church. Among the most perceptive analyses and critiques of wokeness by the dissidents over the past several years have been explorations of the ways that wokeness all along was a particular kind of faith, reflecting not merely some secular political ideology, but an underlying theology, a political theology. Various nonconformists have elucidated and exposed the misguided and even malevolent nature of that ideology, of that theology. Powerful analyses offered, for example, by my friends Rusty Reno and Chad Pecknold on the heretical nature and dimensions of wokeness. Their work echoes that of an earlier generation of conservatives. Perhaps some of you have heard the name Eric Vogelin, who is keenly sensitive to the theological dimensions of communism and of fascism, and in his view, the effort to immanentize the eschaton. That's a bumper sticker you can buy. Don't immanentize the eschaton, to make a heaven out of our fallen earth. Among the many excellent contemporary analyses of wokeism as a form of political theology, none, to my mind, have been more penetrating and more powerful than that of my friend and former colleague at Georgetown University, Professor Josh Mitchell. He ably elucidated the political theology of wokeism in his 2020 book, American Awakening, which in a concentrated form he offered as several addresses, including at NatCon 4 in 2024, a lecture entitled America Already Has an Established Church, Wokeism. Drawing attention to the theological categories of transgression and innocence, of victim and persecutor, Mitchell highlighted the ways that wokeness was able to achieve such prominence and power as quickly as it did, not because it was a secular ideology that was strange and new and simply imported on our shores, but because it had adopted and adapted deep-seated theological categories and beliefs centrally derived from Christianity. It was already here. As he argued in his book, and I quote, "Our long familiarity with Christianity in America means that the invocation of these categories within identity politics derives from Christianity and from Protestantism in particular. Surveys may indicate that Americans have lost or are losing their religion. However, the fever of identity politics that now sweeps the nation suggests these surveys are looking in the wrong place and asking the wrong questions. Americans have not lost their religion," Josh wrote. "Americans have relocated their religion to the realm of politics. The institutional separation of church and state may be largely intact, but the separation of religion and politics has largely collapsed," he wrote. Now, I agree almost entirely, word for word, with Josh's summary claims, as I do with his book by and large, but I would register at least some reservation, if not disagreement, with the sentiment of the closing words, as if there were ever a time in which religion and politics were not uncollapsed. There is always a political theology operative in every political order, and it's a question of whether we know it and notice it and know where to look. There is no neutral or belief-free space. And yet I submit it remains an implicit belief, often unstated by many in the conservative world, perhaps not in this room, although a few may still be holdouts here, that with the defeat of wokeism, the path has now been cleared to bring us back to the good old days of supposed liberal neutrality and the reconstitution of old-school fusionism. But this is a foolish and even dangerous self-deception, and by now we should all know better. Even as many conservatives have trained their keen lenses and powerful analytic abilities on the theological foundations of wokeness, there's been very little to no comparable effort to look at the similarly imperceptible, difficult to see theological foundations of the dead consensus conservatism. Indeed, many who pine for the revival of an old fusionism that seemed to promise a liberation of politics vested with some kind of theological conception of the good, seem to believe that with the death of wokeness, we can return to a value-free politics. Absent any political theology, the implicit claim goes, the social and the private domains might once again flourish. As the state is shorn of any task with the intention of contributing to the human good, goes the hope, families and communities and civil society as a whole will emerge from the detritus of advanced decay and once again flourish. All along, however, an unstated and underlying political theology has been present as an invisible foundation of the once established church of the old school fusionist Republicans. Now, for the sake of giving it a label and perhaps offending half the room, in the first instance, I would submit that this theology consisted of a form of political Calvinism. I see Reverend Wilson there, and I'm a little nervous you're too close, but I'm hoping this barricade will slow you down. That is to say, in the public domain, we understand humans to be profoundly fallen and flawed creatures, sinful, prideful, self-seeking by nature. Government is a lamentable but necessary feature of the human landscape, an ever-present sign of the fall. Government exists solely to restrain our bestial natures, our low and base desires, our propensity to rebel against God and to sin against man. I've often joked with Yoram about the color scheme of national conservatism, and in particular the orange color for the word national. This is clearly a sign that once again Princeton is trying to take over the world. And much of the lamentable political theology that has been foisted on the world comes or came from Princeton. In his most Princeton moment, James Madison, I would say in a moment of weakness perhaps, James Madison expressed this view of political Calvinism in a particularly crystalline form in Federalist 51. The famous lines, you can probably recite them with me. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Now, whatever biblical warrant there might have been for the dubious view that angels are not within a hierarchical order governed by a king, Madison, at least at that moment, articulated a main pillar of political Calvinism. Only the fact of human fallenness has necessitated government. Angels might disagree. It restrains the worst angels of our nature and has no ability whatsoever to bring forth the better angels of our nature. Indeed, because of the fallen and flawed nature of humans, government is both necessary but also a profound danger and must be kept within the very strict boundaries of solely restraining our propensity to evil without ever being allowed futilely to attempt to make us better. Only God can redeem us. The state can't offer grace, and inevitably becomes tyrannical when fallen human beings attempt to make their fallen fellow human beings better. And as the 20th century unfolded, and especially as we witnessed the utopian ambitions and the horrors of socialism and fascism, conservatives came to view the state itself as the most powerful source of corruption and degradation, contributing and even making worse our sinfulness. Among the most important lines in the political Calvinist creed were recited, indeed created, by Ronald Reagan. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Now, before my Calvinist friends, maybe friends-to-be, conclude, I'm simply taking a swipe at them. I want to reassure my Calvinist friends that being a Presbyterian was never a requirement for holding the tenets of political Calvinism, and many do not. And in fact, it may be the case, I would suspect, that above all today it's conservative Catholics who are most fervent in the embrace of this faith, suggesting that the assimilation of this particular tribe was highly successful, if that's success. But there's another fundamental element to the political theology of the old right, and it's a kind of schizophrenic theology. This is a form of private Pelagianism, the belief that we are not fallen, and that we can attain salvation through our own efforts. This view applies to human beings in the private or in the civic realm, a realm that is imagined to be at least potentially free of the inherent stain of human sinfulness. In contrast to the public or political Calvinism that dominates our thinking about politics and government, in the private or the civic sphere, we're thought to be basically good, creatures who are capable of escaping the stain, or at least the worst aspects of the stain of original sin, and if left to our own devices, are prone to be naturally cooperative and gentle and even selfless toward one another. Now, during the ascendant conservatism in the 1980s, throughout roughly the mid-90s, when it was believed that conservatism could dismantle much of the state and return human beings to a state of natural goodness, it was morning in America. But in the more pessimistic conservatism, as the 2000s rolled along, and the conclusion that tyrannical progressivism was here to stay, our hopes were redirected toward forming the equivalent of monastic communities, a Benedict option, where a pure existence in our private and civic spaces might be at least shaped in spite of the depredations and threats of the public order. Now, as we bring to the surface conservatism's operative political theology, at least of yesteryear, it's necessary to recall that this division of the world into a public Calvinism and a private Pelagianism drew its inspiration from at least one major thinker of the American founding in particular, Thomas Paine. As Thomas Paine cited in the famous opening lines of his influential and best-selling pamphlet, very influential pamphlet, Common Sense, "Society," he wrote, "is in every state a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is a necessary evil. Some writers have so confounded society with government as to leave little or no distinction between them, whereas they are not only different, but have different origins. Society is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. The former promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections. The latter, government, negatively by restraining our vices." Paine knew well the theological origins of this view, even if we have forgotten them, because he went on to write, "Government, like dress, like the clothes we wear, is a badge of lost innocence. The palaces of kings are built upon the ruins of the bowers of paradise." Government exists because we are fallen. We are no longer in paradise. As the father of modern conservative political theology, Thomas Paine has often been invoked as one of America's founding fathers. Indeed, Ronald Reagan was often prone to cite Thomas Paine as one of the conservative good guys in our pantheon. But this view obscures the fact that Thomas Paine would go on to fervently support the French Revolution and would engage in a prolonged debate over whether the French Revolution was good or malevolent, with none other than, yes, Edmund Burke. Which side are you on, Paine or Burke? Paine was demonstrably influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher who began his work, The Social Contract, with the line and the claim, "Man is born free and is everywhere in chains. Our natural condition is one of natural goodness, but that natural goodness is corrupted by the rise of a political order." Paine was no conservative, and nor really was his political theology. In fact, I would submit that by adopting this Painian, Rousseauian, French revolutionary preference, political theology, that conservatism has been equally the cause of woe and destruction to the values and the institutions that conservatives all along claimed to hold dear. We simply contributed to the destruction by the sins of omission rather than the sins of commission. Conservatives today agree that the radical political theology of woke progressivism was a profoundly disfiguring and ultimately false belief about the nature of a good society and of a sound political order. But we should hardly conclude that we have been liberated from bad political theology, for it has existed quite some time within the house of conservatism itself. Having now become sensitive to the profound shaping role of political theology, it is now past time for a similar critical reflection about the falsehoods and malformations that can arise from that bad political theology. The schizophrenic political theology of political Calvinism and private Pelagianism served as the implicit underpinning of old conservatism's foundation, of what was called fusionism as it was articulated by its main architect, Frank Meyer, someone whose name has been much in the news due to a recent book by Daniel Flynn, very much worth reading. In Meyer's 1962 book, In Defense of Liberty, Meyer echoed Paine's division of politics as the realm that exists for restraining human evil from the social realm, which is the locus of human virtue. At base, his argument for radical political freedom, freedom from any law, ordinance, public stance that might seek to shape us for the good, was that only in the conditions of complete political liberty could the choice of virtue come about in a completely uncoerced and hence genuine form. Any outward practice of virtue that was not freely chosen, but was the result of coercion, was in his view merely the simulacrum of virtue. It's imitation, or it's a version, a not true version of it. The state merely existed to prohibit evils, not to promote the good. In Meyer's words, and I quote, "Virtue is not a political problem. It is not the concern of the state." Here is the most perfect articulation of Paine's political theology, with a particular emphasis upon private Pelagianism. We are wholly responsible for our own salvation, or at least the attainment of virtue. The only real form of virtue comes through our own efforts alone. Any outward coercion merely gives rise to the outward form or performance of virtue, not real virtue, not the essence of virtue. The only place where virtue can occur in an uncoerced way, it's suggested, was civil society. Though one might wonder, how is it the case that the coercion that takes place, presumably of parents over children, or communities over individuals, not similarly coercive? But we'll put that to the side. Grace can only be earned, or virtue can only be attained, where the state plays no role in the attempt to form or shape or advance virtue. Now, in Meyer's defense, perhaps this faith was justified in the early 1960s, before the thorough cratering of civil society. But even then, a few prophetic voices noticed that by drawing this radical distinction between these two domains, Meyer and the resulting fusionism that defined the conservative movement opened the door to the public valorization of individual liberty that would not prove to be so easily separable from what was supposed to be the social valorization of virtue. Today's epigones of Meyer are quick to point out the ways that progressivism and wokeness have contributed to the decline of marriage, to the loss of the desire to form families, to the decline of religion, and even loss of patriotism toward the nation. But because of their remnant faith commitments to an old-time political theology, they are unwilling or even incapable of acknowledging the way that yesterday's right and its commitments, among other things, to a globalized market form of freedom was also complicit in disassembling the conditions necessary for the flourishing of virtue. Can it really be credited any longer that merely disassembling DEI will lead to the restoration of communal cultivation of virtue? Can we credit the view that overturning Obergefell, something to be desired, will lead to the restoration of health of heterosexual marriage? Do we believe that dismantling gender ideology will lead our young people to want to have children and to have children? Do we really think that defunding various gender and race-based studies departments in universities will usher in a restoration of genuine liberal education? Here's a secret. While many of the older people may be in this room, but maybe certainly conservatives outside of this room, hold fast to the old faith. Get rid of the bad, and the good will arise out of a kind of spontaneous order. Most, if not nearly all, of the people in this room who are under the age of 35 do not believe this at all. And look at the heads nodding. They are in search of a new faith, of a new political theology. The lineaments of that new conservative political theology are already being drawn. It rejects both political Calvinism, while not rejecting the truth that we are fallen, as well as private Pelagianism, the belief that simply good arises out of a kind of spontaneous loam that needs no cultivating. Above all, that new political theology rejects the division of the world between one of public vices and private virtues, recognizing there's an inextricable continuum and mutually reinforcing relationship between these two domains. In this regard, the new political theology returns to an understanding, I would submit, closer to that of our founding fathers. Not Paine, the others. Those who drafted a constitution in which it would be largely left to the states, they believed, through the force of law and custom and simply public recognition of honor, what one honors and what one does not confer honor toward, to establish the public as well as the civic conditions of political, civic, and familial virtue. Indeed, this was the case in every state that ratified the Constitution. Having now gone through a period in which the institutions of civil society are in a condition of profound disrepair, it is tantamount to cruelty to claim that all that is needed is more individual liberty. Our young people need assistance from the public order in order to make it easier for them to marry, to buy a house, to have children. And I'm very pleased and gratified, and I feel not a little bit of satisfaction to see Heritage Foundation come around to a view that a few of us have been arguing for a few years. Amen. That's really going to help. You know, tweeting is one thing, but having a big institution in DC is another. Working class people need the help of the public order to revive American industry and to restore a family wage. Students need the help of the public order to revive the forms of a liberal education for a modern age. One designed not merely for self-examination of liberal selves, but one designed to foster a society of cohesion and solidarity. Our communities need the assistance of the public order to strengthen their downtowns, to make them more neighborly, high trust, old-fashioned. In other words, the kind of city that I lived in last year, Boulder, Colorado. A wonderfully old-fashioned city, but absolutely teeming with progressives who make sure that no one can get into that situation unless you have $1 million price tag to buy a house. In other words, it's a luxury good and no longer a public utility. And yes, our churches and their teachings would benefit from the support they once enjoyed, from the public recognition of and the gratitude toward our Creator, by extending and deepening the acknowledgement that we only flourish as a people under God. So to conclude, even as we celebrate, as we rightly should, the liberation from the false gods of wokeness, we should be attentive to Christ's admonition that we not be so focused on the mote that is in our progressive brother's eye while ignoring the beam that is in our own conservative eye. Speaking for myself, I refuse to believe that the decay of our civil society is so advanced that it can't be reversed by concerted efforts of restoration from both within civil society, of course, but with the imaginative and focused support of the public order, our order. We've heard much from conservatism in the last decades about the need of the blessings of liberty. But I think for the moment it's time to focus equally, if not more, upon the crying need to provide for the general welfare, to ensure domestic tranquility, and to build a more perfect union. Thank you.